Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Mergers and Acquisitions webinar. My name is Hannah Fernandez, and I'm the chapter chair of SCORE Chicago. To give you a quick background, SCORE has been around as a resource partner of the SBA since 1964, providing free and confidential business mentoring for business owners across the country. So whether you're a new entrepreneur or you've been in business for a long time, our SCORE mentors can help you start, grow, and scale your businesses. To schedule an appointment with us, just go to our website at chicago.score.org. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenter. David Wilbrand is the chairperson at Thompson Hines, early stage and emerging company practice, working primarily with tech and biotech. Before joining Thompson Hines, he worked in the software industry, holding the role of CFO and general counsel, a series of venture-backed companies. Prior to that, he practiced law in Boulder, Colorado. So David combines broad and deep legal knowledge with real-world business and transactional experience. He drives, facilitates, and closes deals. He graduated from Harvard University in 1992 and the University of Cincinnati College of Law in 1996, where he was valedictorian and also the editor-in-chief of the Law Review. David teaches mergers and acquisitions at the University of Michigan Law School. He also teaches startups and venture capital at the Syracuse University College of Law and the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Prior to that, David taught agency and partnership at UC. Lastly, he is also a lecturer at the nationally ranked Miami University Institute for Entrepreneurship, where he serves as an entrepreneur in residence. David, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction, Hannah, especially noting the year of graduation from college. You can do the math.
That's always a fun time, right?
Right.
Well, David, before you get started on your presentation, let's do a quick poll just to see who's with us and also what brought everybody here. Does that sound good? And to those of you who are attending, know that the user information in this poll will be kept anonymous, so please participate. So here we go. Let me launch the poll. So please answer for us, how long have you been in business? Are you a startup that's been around less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, over 10 years? So David, it looks like a lot of people have been around for 6 to 10 years or over 10 years on the call. So definitely a lot of established businesses.
Yeah.
And as far as for what brought them here today, they're interested in either selling your business, buying a business, getting acquired by another company, or just learning. So as you can see, it's fairly spread out between selling and buying a company, about 12% getting acquired, and a lot of people also just learning as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do is I'll give people a few more seconds, and then we'll get started. This just kind of gives you an idea of who's with us today.
It's very helpful.
Let me end the polling and share the results of the attendees right now. And here we go. All right, so David, you're co-host and you're on.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks for conducting the poll as well to give us some baseline information. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be with you, 3-ish Central Time here in Chicago. Spring is in the air, sort of, trying to be, and which is nice. It's a good thing. So today's topic is mergers and acquisitions. As Hannah mentioned, I teach it at University of Michigan Law School. I'm also teaching it this semester at Ohio State Law School. This is a 3-credit-hour class. It's very nuanced. It can be very detailed and sophisticated. We obviously don't have, call it 24 to 30 hours in front of us to cover it from top to bottom. And I wouldn't necessarily wish that on my worst enemy to do it in one stretch. That's why we break it up over the course of a semester. But we just don't fill the time with empty talk. There's a lot to cover. So today we're endeavoring to hit the high points in 2 hours, which I think is very doable. There's no reason for us to sprint wildly and try to cover all the ground. Instead, let's just focus on the high points, the points of interest that I think will be of interest to all of you, and it will be of relevance to you as you think about mergers and acquisitions. I do think it's important to note, I am a practicing lawyer. I teach in law schools. So the angle that I bring will be a legal angle. I will be speaking to these issues through a legal lens and with a legal framework in mind. But, I am a business lawyer. And so what I'm tasked with doing by my clients is translating those legal issues and applying them into business circumstances. And so taking legal jargon, translating it into business talk, and making sure that these concepts all align. So I'm not looking to train you to be lawyers. I'm looking to speak to you as business people, but I will be speaking to you with these legal concepts in mind in ways that I think are relevant, not just in theory or in abstract or from a trivia perspective, but because they do impact how you think about selling a business or buying a business. So let's start at the top. We talk about M&A. What does that stand for? It stands for mergers and acquisitions in the United States. And it's important to make that point right up front, because every country has a different body of law that applies to the world of acquisitions. And these things change internationally, country to country, nation to nation, in terms of what's permissible, what's not, how they work. But in the United States, we have 3 primary ways of structuring this kind of business combination, this kind of M&A deal. One way is through an asset deal. And what happens in an asset deal is you have the seller, and the seller will convey to the buyer most or all of its assets. The legal language that we use is all or substantially all of their assets. So it makes it an asset deal. We'll convey those to the buyer. The buyer has the option of assuming some or all of the liabilities, or perhaps none of the liabilities of seller. It's one of the attractions of the asset deal structure to a buyer, that they have the opportunity to be selective. They can pick and choose the assets that they want, and they can pick and choose the liabilities that they want. This is the only deal structure that offers buyer that kind of flexibility, which makes it very attractive to buyers. And it's why a lot of buyers start with that. The idea that they have that opportunity to pick and choose by doing a deal as an asset deal. Not to spend too much time on tax, but tax is relevant. I'm always going to say generally speaking, because tax laws are notoriously specific. And so, don't take this as biblical truth, but treat it as sort of a point of general impression. And the point of general impression is this: another advantage of the asset deal structure. I think we're getting, do you hear that feedback, Anna? Like, could everybody be on mute? So thanks. So with the asset deal structure, another advantage from a tax perspective to the buyer is they get what's called a step up in basis. And that is advantageous to the buyer from a future depreciation opportunity perspective. You don't always get that with some of the other deal structures. So buyers tend to really like asset deals, pick and choose the assets and liabilities that you pick up, and you get that step up in basis. It's very attractive to buyers. To sellers, well, it's not always the best deal structure. Part of the problem with the buyer picking and choosing which assets and liabilities that they want is inevitably you're going to be left with some as the seller. So you've got to do something with that. So you consummate the transaction, you close the transaction, you've sold your business to the buyer through this transaction and assets and liabilities, but you still have something left. You don't get to go buy your boat yet. You got to clean all this up. So if you want to call it quits, tie a knot, tie it off, you're going to have to dispose of whatever assets you have left. So if you've got some office chairs still sitting around, you got to do something with those. If you have some other Real assets, you've got to figure out a way to handle those as well. More importantly, liabilities. Chances are you've been left with some. Could be it could be the rent on your office space. There could be some equipment leases that you've been left with that the buyer didn't feel like it needed. Could be money that you owe to the bank. They just didn't want to undertake it or assume it. You've got to pay that off. So you've got to spend some time sorting through these trailing niggling little issues that you need to resolve before you can cleanly wrap this up. When you do, then typically what you'll do is you'll liquidate your company, you'll terminate it, you'll dissolve that entity, and whatever is left on a net positive basis, you'll distribute out to the owners through some kind of liquidating distribution or liquidating dividend. That's how the ultimate owners, the ultimate stakeholders get paid. When they're saying, show me the money, that's the moment that the money is shown. It's 2 steps. Buyer conveys the money to the seller, the entity, then seller dissolves and liquidates. The egg gets cracked open. The money makes its way to the stockholders. That's an asset deal in a nutshell. Now, from a tax perspective, an asset deal is generally fine to a seller if the seller is what we call a pass-through entity. So an S corporation or a limited liability company, an LLC, that's elected to be taxed as an S corporation, or which is elected to be taxed as a partnership. With those sort of pass-through entities, the seller is not a taxpayer. So no tax is due at the seller level. The tax is ultimately paid at the level of the ultimate stockholders or partners or members. It passes through. So for them, that's fine. That works just fine and is something that we're going to see show up with some of these other deal structures. But if you're a C corporation as a seller, asset deals are terrible. This is double taxation. So the C corporation sells the assets, conveys whatever liabilities that it's going to sell and convey. It receives cash for those assets, and it must pay tax on the gain. And it liquidates and dissolves, pushes whatever's left out to the stockholders, and the stockholders have to pay tax. That's double taxation. That's what C corps are known for. There are lots of good reasons to be a C corporation. I do, as Hannah mentioned, I primarily represent tech and biotech companies. They're almost always organized as C corporations. That's the gold standard in the world of venture capital. And there's a reason for that. But what it means is that when it comes time to sell those companies, we really don't want to do asset deal structures. That's really bad for us as sellers. But like I said, if you're a traditional operating company, as most companies in the United States are, an asset deal is just fine for you. And it works. And I would say that most M&A deals that I work on where the seller is an LLC or an S corporation, I'm doing an asset deal, notwithstanding some of the administrative heartburn that's left for the seller at the end of the equation. So that's an asset deal. Let's go to one that's super easy. Share purchase transaction. That's the second type of acquisition structure. So first is an asset deal, the other is a share purchase. And this is as simple as saying, here's my selling entity, this is my target, and they're owners. And all the owners do is they have shares of stock or membership interests or whatever represents their ownership, they sell those to the buyer. So it's owned by these stockholders and they just sell their stock to this other entity. Company slides over, now it's a subsidiary of this buyer. Or if it's an individual buyer, now they own this company 100%. It's as simple as that. It's so elegant. It's so easy to do. You can do it on a single piece of paper. You can do it by scribbling on the back of the stock certificate. Now it's usually not done that way. Buyers tend to like to have a little bit more meat, and we'll talk about what that meat looks like, but it's an extremely elegant transaction. Sellers tend to love it. Sellers like it because there's no cleanup. All they did was convey their shares and boom, the whole entity slid over. There's nothing else to do. Shares, money, done. No extra liabilities to clean up, no extra assets to clean up. It's go to the boat store. The other piece of it is generally if you've been holding that stock for more than a year, long-term capital gains. It's a great tax outcome for the selling stockholders with that kind of a setup. The buyer, certainly they're glad the seller's happy, and it's a simple transaction for them to effectuate too, but they didn't get to pick and choose assets and liabilities. They had to take them all because the whole company traveled over. So the buyer needs to have a lot of confidence that they can take on this company without needing to leave something behind or something to abandon, because they're taking it all on. And that's, something potentially negative for the buyer. The other thing is they don't get to step up in basis. Put a pin in that for a moment. And that was an advantage to them in the asset deal scenario. They don't get it in the share purchase scenario. So the tax piece of it may not be as exciting for them. Now, there is something called, again, we're not going to drive the tax bus too aggressively through this conversation, but it's worth noting. It's called Section 338H10. It applies when you have a corporate buyer and you have an S corporation seller. If that's your situation, you can make this election and it's a stock sale, but you can characterize it as an asset deal. So it's kind of best of both worlds. The seller gets that ease of transaction, smooth, simple, everything travels over, but the buyer gets the benefit of the asset deal tax advantages that would flow in an asset deal scenario. So just keep that in mind. If you're an S corporation and you're looking to sell, that may be a way to structure a deal that sort of is a silver bullet. If you're in the S corporation world, you see a lot of these sorts of transactions. I'm simplifying it, but in a nutshell, that's what happens with a 338H10 transaction. So we have an asset deal, pros and cons for both sides. We have a share purchase transaction, pros and cons for both sides. And then we have a merger. That's the third type of method of acquisition. And in a merger transaction, and not every country has a merger law. So it's not something that should just be assumed that, oh, well, we've done this for thousands of years. This was somehow, emerged from the Garden of Eden. You had a man, you had a woman, you had a snake, you had a curious apple, and you had merger laws. It didn't work that way. We sort of made this up, and we made it up in a very ingenious way. It's where, and I tie it to the Garden of Eden because it's like a miracle. You have two companies, and then you have a merger, and you have one company, and that's it. The other one just disappears. It evaporates by virtue of this transaction. The typical, very simple merger, which we would call a forward merger, is that the seller merges into the buyer, the seller dissolves, disappears, the language we use, the buyer survives, all the assets and all the liabilities of seller, of target, vest in buyer. Seller's former stockholders now have the right to receive whatever deal consideration was bargained for, and the deal's over. And in that context, buyer has all the assets and liabilities of seller. There's no cleanup for seller to do. Seller has its money. And generally speaking, a forward merger gets taxed as an asset deal. So there's a lot about this that sellers like because they get rid of all those assets and liabilities in one fell swoop, like with a share purchase. Buyers don't mind it so much because they tend to get the tax benefit of an asset deal, although they do have to take all the assets and liabilities, so never forget that. And that's a key component of that. Two little additional glosses, and then we'll move into deal process. Some of you may have heard of something called a forward triangular merger, sometimes called a forward subsidiary merger. And then in its most exotic form, a reverse triangular merger or a reverse subsidiary merger. Sounds fancy. It's not as complicated as it is, but it is miraculous. Simply what's happening here is that the buyer is saying, I don't want all those assets and liabilities to end up in my house. I want a little separation. So the buyer will create a subsidiary, will drop down a sub, is the kind of language you hear people use. And all the action takes place between this acquisition sub and the seller. If the seller disappears into that sub, that's a forward triangular merger. If instead, and this is pretty wild, the acquisition sub disappears into the seller actually still exists. It's the surviving corporation, but now it's owned by the buyer. That's a reverse subsidiary merger. I don't want you to get too lost on this. But generally speaking, a forward triangular merger is taxed as an asset deal, and a reverse triangular merger is taxed as a stock deal because the outcome is the same, actually, reverse triangular merger or a stock deal. You start with seller, you end with seller as a sub. of buyer in both of those scenarios. You just get there through a different pathway. So again, we could spend hours on this. Let's not. But at a high level, this is what we're talking about. Asset deal, pros and cons, share purchase or stock deal, pros and cons, and then a merger transaction, pros and cons. And within the merger category, you have the forward merger. You also have the forward triangular merger and the reverse triangular merger. Now, if you want to really round it out, you're probably wondering, is there such a thing as a reverse merger? And there is. You tend not to see those very often in general acquisition world, but there's one place where you see them all the time, and some of you may have been reading about these in the news, is that's what happens in a SPAC transaction. You have the SPAC, which is a special purpose acquisition company. That's what SPAC stands for. It's an acronym. It's publicly traded. And they raise some money, and their whole job is to go buy another company. That's why they're called an acquisition company. You pop up as an operating company, and you do a reverse merger. There's a merger between the two, except your company survives. Okay, it's not a forward merger. The acquisition company would survive. In a reverse merger, you survive, except now you're publicly traded. The SPAC was publicly traded, and now you merge into it. You survive, but you survive with that public company ownership base. And it's a very unique and twisty way to become a public company. That's where you see reverse mergers. It's basically the only place where you see reverse mergers, is in the context of these SPAC transactions. And when that happens, what I just described, if you really want to sound like a cool kid, it's called a de-SPACing. Because the SPAC is the acquisition company. The de-SPAC is when the operating company, the thing that really is now a real business, merges with and into the SPAC, and that operating company survives. That's a de-SPAC transaction. It's an acquisition. It's a merger. But we call it a de-SPAC. So anyhow, fun with SPACs. I felt like we had to mention it at least once because we're mentioning it with everything. I should probably mention Bitcoin as well. There, I just did. Now I think I've covered all the current bases of everything that people talk about on a day-to-day basis in business. So that at a high level is what we're talking about. These are acquisition structures. Now, I lead with that, but I don't want that to be the focus, because acquisition structures are important, and it's important to start the conversation with that first while I've got your attention. And the second piece of it is because that's an important takeaway. But when you're thinking about selling your company, or you're thinking about buying your company, you don't start by saying, I'm going to go do a stock deal, or I'm going to go do a merger, or I'm going to go do an asset deal. No, you're thinking about a transaction. And you start a process by saying, I want to sell my company, and I want to sell it to a third party on the best terms that I can get. So I want to make sure that it's a third party that I believe in, that I trust, it's credible. I want to get as much for the company as I can. I want to sell it at maximum value to the extent I can get it, and I want the terms to be attractive. And terms would include deal structure. What kind of tax liability are you undertaking? What kind of post-closing cleanup are you going to have if it's an asset deal? Those sorts of things are all relevant. But these are the tails that sometimes wag the dog, but shouldn't be allowed to wag it too vigorously. Let's get the right third party. Let's run a good process, and let's get the best price. And then these other pieces will largely take care of themselves through the M&A process. Now we're going to move into that process now. That'll be the next piece of this. But let me add one final thought before we dive into some of these slides. And it's this, and this is a conversation I have with my clients all the time, because in my world, in the startup world, companies are generally speaking, they're built to be sold. All right. They're not looking to start these tech or biotech companies with the notion of running profitably, as my law firm tries to do, and as 99.999% of normal quote unquote companies in a free market economy do. These are a special brand of company that are probably going to be losing money throughout their existence, working on product development, working on achieving market share, and then ultimately selling. So they are very specifically and intentionally focused ultimately on M&A. But I think it's every company at some point thinks about it and should, and certainly can think about being on the buy side. But the point that I make is, with so much in business, we're extremely intentional about and proactive about what it is that we're doing. No one believes that the best employees are just going to find you and show up, and that customers are just going to find you and show up, and the good suppliers are just going to find you and show up. The right office space is just going to somehow, be dropped in your mailbox with a nice set of pamphlets, and you're going to know where to go. You got to go get these things. You got to go discover them. You got to do some diligence. You're going to have to do some work. You have to do some selling, and you're going to have to land these things on your own directionally. But somehow when it comes to selling your company, people sort of feel like, well, if I build it, they will come. And look, I wish I could tell you that this economy were that transparent and information was shared broadly and wildly, and everybody had perfect information at all moments in time and could operate like a Vulcan and can decide what they want to do transactionally that day. But that, of course, is not the case. It's like everything. It's relationships. It's what they've been made aware of recently. It's who they know. It's where these people are. It's the right place, right time. So if you want to sell your company, you're going to have to work at it. You might be one of those people who gets lucky. The right buyer may just find you because they know of you or they're aware of you. But my experience has been that, in particular, the sellers who have done the best, it's oftentimes a 2, 3, 4-year courting process with the buyer. It starts by meeting at a trade show, when we used to have those, and hopefully we'll soon have them again, or some other environment where they start to get to know each other. Seller decides that company might be interested in buying me someday. I need to start developing that relationship. So the seller, very intentionally and with determination reaches out, starts the conversation. Hey, I'm not looking for anything. I just want to talk to you. I want to tell you what I'm up to. And you can tell me what you're up to, and maybe there's something here we can do. And sometimes there is. Sometimes there's a commercial relationship that emerges and makes sense. Some kind of co-marketing deal, co-development deal, something like that. Sometimes it matures to the point where this larger company, this potential buyer, wants to invest in you, not buy you, but invest in you, maybe make you a loan, but more often than not, it's an equity investment and they take an ownership interest. Usually it's small and usually it's less than 20%, but just to have some skin in the game. And then, ultimately it may graduate to the point where, an M&A transaction takes place, but it doesn't just come out of the blue. It's been cultivated, it's been worked. There was romance. And so I would encourage you all to do that. To the extent that you think you may want to sell your company someday, you should have a list in your head, if not on paper, of who the likely candidates might be to buy you, and what kind of relationships do you have with and into those companies. And if the answer is none, or if the answer is weak ones, work on that and develop and cultivate those. One final thought on this point. Investment bankers can help. Business brokers can help. Accountants who act in those roles can help. These are all intermediaries that can help market and sell your company. And, I've worked with some truly terrible intermediaries, but I've also worked with some fantastic intermediaries, and there are more good ones than bad ones for sure. But even the good ones will tell you, look, if you really want to maximize the outcome, the notion that you're going to start cold with an investment banker or a business broker, and they're going to go figure this all out on their own, identify the targets, cultivate the relationships, establish the relationships, and sell the company through their own efforts. It's unlikely. It's unlikely. It happens sometimes, but it's rare. And I'll tell you, the times that I see it happen, I'm not always convinced it was the best outcome for the seller, because there's no way that these intermediaries are going to have they can't get the relationships and the knowledge that you have. You're in the best position to do that. And so if you do that work, those people can help. They're incredibly helpful when it comes to facilitating the sales process. And we're going to talk about that right now. In the same way that accountants are helpful and lawyers are helpful, everyone has a role to play. But if the notion is, well, they're going to do it for me, and I just can't do it at all by myself, hey, if that's where you are, you got to do what you got to do. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you or promise that it's the best way to handle it, because generally speaking, it's not. So with all of that said as prelude, let's move into a few slides to help visualize this a little bit. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a moment. Hannah, I'm going to ask you to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Great. Thanks. So let's start with this deck, which is the M&A deal process. Here you can see my email address. Don't hesitate to ping me if you have questions, things that I don't get to in this presentation. I'd be happy to pick those up offline. david.wilbrand@thompsonhine.com. So this is the process overview. And of course, this is somewhat generic and somewhat high level, but for purposes of illustration, I think it's useful. So it's understanding the objectives, the team, what you hope to get for the company, it's the valuation, and how to think about what kind of decision you're going to make. Let's look at the team on the next slide. You've got your key executives, of course, the owner operator and or the CEO, CFO, COO, but it's important to define a team, particularly on the sell side. This transaction is going to be incredibly time consuming, and chances are you have a business to run. It's one of the reasons why you think that you might be attractive to a third party. And you probably have a full-time job already, and now you're going to try to sell your company. And you're going to see, is what we talk about, that there's a lot for the people involved to do. So, I strongly encourage business people to set up deal teams and to be very clear about who's doing what. I will tell you that everybody wants to be on the deal team because it seems fun and interesting and sexy and different. Try to be disciplined, try to limit it to only those who are essential. Try to keep everybody else focused on the business so that you still have something interesting to sell by the time you get to the closing table. And then beyond that, make sure that the day-to-day roles that the people on the deal team are supposed to execute, you've got some coverage and some backfill, because they're not going to be able to give the same time and attention that they used to. Outside of that, of course, we have the transaction attorneys, near and dear to my heart, me. We have accountants, and we have the M&A advisor, the intermediary, business broker, investment banker, et cetera. This is a typical team, and that's established in the phase one preparation. Of course, we're defining our market and our marketing strategy. How are we going to find the buyers? How are we thinking about the buyers? Hopefully you've done the pre-work that I talked about, and you've prepped yourself, and you've got relationships and grooves already established. Let's talk about what this piece means, what I'm referring to, the profile and the SIM and the NDA. So the non-disclosure agreement, the NDA, appears as a way to allow you, and most or all of you know what an NDA is. It allows you to share confidential information comfortably, safely with a third party. And there's going to come a point in time where you're going to need to start sharing confidential information with potential buyers, and you're going to want them to sign an NDA before they do that. Now, related to that is something called the profile. Sometimes it's called a teaser. It's 1 page, 2 pages, maybe 3 pages. I don't like to see them get that long or too much longer than that, because it's supposed to be a teaser. It's just supposed to be the bait on the hook to get potential buyers interested. Now, sometimes even these teasers include some confidential information. And so as the seller, you're going to want to make sure that the NDAs get signed in advance of sharing the teaser. I encourage companies to try to create a teaser that they can share without an NDA. As any of you know that, in the course of business using NDAs, it's just anytime you introduce friction to a process, you put the process at risk. You're just testing people's willingness to engage. And particularly if you're casting about on a fairly broad base of potential buyers, you don't want to make it hard for them to start to learn about you and hopefully get seduced by your story. If you lead by saying, I'm Jane, my company is XYZ Inc., I think I'd like to sell to you. Please sign this NDA before I share any information. The buyer may say, I don't know, I got a lot to do. But if you can share the teaser up front and set the hook a little bit, then the buyer may say, or potential buyer may say, I want to take another step or two. And you say, great, I would love for you to take another step or two. At this point, how about you sign an NDA and then I can share some more information. I think that's a better process and a better cadence. What's the SIM? Well, SIM stands for Confidential Information Memorandum. They can go by lots of different names, but I think you'll hear most people refer to it as a SIM loosely. Now, it has confidential in the name. So it is something that you really want to. I have seen cases where people created these in such a way that they were comfortable delivering a SIM without an NDA, but that's really rare. They generally do contain detailed confidential information. It's like a prospectus, usually like a private placement memorandum or an offering memorandum, but it tends to include some pretty intense information about the company and pretty proprietary and confidential information about the company, financial and otherwise. This is what you're really providing to the buyer and saying, here's all the core information that you really need to know about us. And of course, it's structured and it's spun and it's presented in a way to tell a message. And it's your pitch on paper. You know, this is why you should buy me. This is why I'm sure to bring you delight. It's a selling document, but it's a disclosure document, and it probably includes confidential information. So you're going to have an NDA ahead of that. This takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. A SIM doesn't get built in a night. It's something that really gets tweaked. You know, people labor over every word because it really does need to sing. This is you putting your best foot forward to the market. It's what you are going to use or what your intermediary is going to use to try to pitch you. Controlled auction, what are we referring to here? Well, there are a couple of different ways that you can go about trying to find a match. And I think at a high level, you can start with two different categories. One type of marketing strategy, you know, sort of matchmaking strategy is what I sometimes refer to as the negotiated sale route. And here the notion is it's always binary, single seller, single buyer. It might be the seller approaching just one buyer. It might be the buyer approaching the seller. And in that case, for whatever reason, the parties have decided that the seller has decided that they're not going to market this deal broadly. And the buyer has decided that they want to dig in preemptively and make an offer that the seller can't refuse, keep seller out of the market, lock seller up, and get the deal done. That's most transactions, frankly, happen that way. Some form or fashion, single seller, single buyer. Now, the auction process is the one that a lot of people hear about because it does tend to be pretty public and people tend to be exposed to it a little bit more. But in that process, it's where the seller has literally said, we want to go sell ourselves. Now, they can do it through just an auction where the intermediary, and if you're running an auction, you are definitely going to want to have an intermediary of some sort. It's hard to run a good auction just with in-house people. So you're going to want a professional helping you navigate that and structure and orchestrate it. If you run just a broad-based auction, anybody can show up. And, you know, sometimes that works really well. I had a client, very, very interesting company. A lot of great stuff was happening. They knew that they were going to garner a lot of interest. And the banker structured a broad-based auction. And there were 30 buyers who submitted indications of interest, just a high level of saying, yeah, we're interested. We want to take the next step. Send us the NDA. 30, that's a lot. Also shows you that the amount of work that the management team was going to have to go through and how they would be distracted from the business and how they needed to take account of that and make sure they covered for it. A controlled auction is, as its name indicates, there tends to be a smaller base. And basically the decision is made is to say, look, we could try to canvass the world, but we think we're going to end up with a lot of randoms. We think we're going to end up wasting time on a lot of parties that aren't really prime for us. We know the 2, 3, 6, 8 buyers who are most likely to purchase our business. Let's just focus on them. The downside is maybe you were wrong. You know, maybe you missed the perfect buyer who would have found you through an open auction process. But frankly, that usually isn't the case. You usually really do know. And I would say most auctions that I see structured and orchestrated are controlled auctions because they're just more efficient from a time perspective. Buyer doesn't get distracted by a whole bunch of noisy buyers, many of whom, by the way, are just there to information gather and are looking just to learn what they can, but they're not serious buyers. So it's a nice way to manage and control the flow of information. It's a nice way to manage and control the investment of time by management, and you tend not to give much up in terms of trying to optimize your outcome and optimize your price. So that's how a controlled auction typically works. You'll of course get to a point where you'll be selecting the buyer and determining what the deal structure is: asset deal, share purchase, merger. And then, once you've got your match, either through a negotiated sale, buyer and seller find each other, or through an auction or controlled auction, eventually you get down to one buyer, 1-to-1. Now we actually go through the selling process. The buyer starts to engage in very serious due diligence. We negotiate the purchase agreement and the other related documents, and we close the transaction. That's phase 3. So we've covered a lot of this already in terms of how to think about marketing. This just provides a little bit more detail. And this, again, describes what we would look at as a somewhat controlled auction. We could do a narrow focus with 3 to 5 buyers. If you felt like you wanted to expand it a little bit, you go to 15 or 30. It's pretty aggressive. You're not going to see that a lot, but it might be the right move in a particular scenario. We have the teaser document. We have the SIM. Now let's get into this with a little bit more detail. What's happening when we are trying to land this buyer? So we've selected our target audience. We know who we're pitching to, and we know how we're doing it. We amplify their interest through the teaser and the NDA and the SIM. In a perfect world, in an auction environment, the seller is going to get multiple letters of intent. Let's talk about this for a moment. What's a letter of intent? An LOI. An LOI is a non-binding expression of interest, and it can go by many different names. It can go by letter of intent. It can go by term sheet. It can go by memorandum of understanding. It can go by summary of terms. Sometimes people use the word indication of interest here. So don't get hung up on nomenclature because it can change. Some people think there's a difference between a term sheet and a letter of intent, that a term sheet represents sort of a high-level advanced version in grid format. A letter of intent is somehow more professional or connecting. It's not really true legally. It may be what someone has worked through from a process perspective. But the basic point is before the parties say, let's go hire lawyers, let's go hire accountants, let's go release the hounds on this transaction, and we also invest a ton of time and energy with our people, let's make sure that we have the high-level deal points hammered through. We've got a basic agreement on purchase price. We have basic agreement on deal structure. We have basic agreement on other key elements of the transaction. I've seen letters of intent that were 30 pages long. I've seen letters of intent, quote unquote, that were 3 bullet points in an email. Both work. Both are fine. From a legal perspective, if I'm representing the seller, my counsel generally is negotiate the most detailed letter of intent you can. And what I would compare this to, roughly speaking, it's not the perfect metaphor, but it's a rough metaphor, is selling a house. And, many people have been through the purchase and sale of residential real estate, so it, makes for a decent analogy. As most of you probably know, the seller has maximum leverage before they sign that purchase agreement and take that sign out of the yard. Because at that point in time, that gives them a chance. The buyer's thirsty. The buyer wants to get the seller locked down. And the seller this is its best opportunity to put in whatever kind of fencing it wants to put in. Flip side is once that purchase agreement is signed and you're in that stage between signing and closing, and buyer is doing its inspection and engaging in other diligence, seller is super pregnant with this transaction. Seller wants to close it. First of all, seller has probably already gone and picked their next house, and they need this one to sell in order to go buy that next house. And they don't want to have to remarket their house. They don't want to have to say no to buyer and go back on the market and start the process all over again, particularly with a busted deal in the background that a lot of people are going to know about, which is going to suggest that maybe there's something wrong with the house. So during that stage, if buyer pops up and says, you know, I know the purchase price was $400,000, but we just did a home inspection and you've got some roof issues. You know, I think this is going to need a new roof. I got an estimate, 30 grand. I think you're going to need to take $30,000 off the purchase price. I thought the house was worth $400,000, but that was before I knew it needed a new roof. I don't see that as being something that enhances the value. I see it as maintaining the value. So I'm going to buy the house for $370,000. Well, the seller can say no. I don't agree to that accommodation, but the seller probably will, or they'll meet in there somewhere. Seller's over a barrel. Buyer has more leverage. The same thing works in an M&A transaction. If the seller wants to avoid that quote unquote roof argument, the seller is going to say up front, listen, buyer, I'm not taking the sign out of the yard and I'm not signing anything until I know you're signed off on that roof, because I have a feeling that that's the kind of thing that you're going to get wrapped up around. So I'm not bending. So whatever you want to do, go do it now, because we're not having this conversation again. Now, does that always work? No, it doesn't always work. Buyer can always have the conversation again, regardless of what they said. But the point is, if you're the seller, if you're going to ask for something, ask for it up front. If you're a buyer, when I'm on the buy side, I like my term sheets high level. I like them limited because that gives me lots of room to retrade after the LOI is signed, because I know I have the seller. You may not like the way that sounds, but that's strategy, and it's the implementation of tactics, and that kind of gamesmanship happens all the time. So those aren't the only reasons to have a long-term sheet or a short-term sheet, but they're good rules of thumb to keep in mind. Flip side is, I will tell you this, the business people always want to move fast, and they don't have a lot of patience for working on a letter of intent. So that's a tension that I'm always facing on the sell side. I may want to have a long letter of intent. I may think that it's in the best interest of my client, but if my client is saying, we got to get this letter of intent signed up ASAP so that we can get this purchase agreement negotiated and signed up ASAP so that we can get this deal closed ASAP, because I'm not sure this economy is going to continue. I'm not sure all these customers are going to stick with me. I'm not sure all these employees are going to hang with me, and I need to get this puppy sold and closed before, blank hits the fan. Well, you got to do what you got to do. And what you're not going to do as the lawyer and say, well, we should have a 30-page term sheet. No, you're going to do the one-page variety and do the best you can. So, these are the different puts and calls that are involved, but those are some basics for you to keep in mind. Now, if you're in a negotiated sales scenario, it's like I said, it's binary. Seller and buyer are negotiating the letter of intent between themselves. What happens with an auction, ideally, is that you're getting more than one letter of intent as the seller. So you sit back and you say, if you're serious about this, you need to submit a letter of intent by 5 o'clock Central Time on Friday, March 12th. And hopefully, when you look in your inbox, you've got 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, and you get to pull them up and you pick the one you like best. That's a great situation to be in. You love that. And it gives you a chance to set them all side by side and decide which letter of intent you're going to sign. You only get to pick one, but certainly nice to have options. More information on the teaser and the sim. I already covered this. Talked about the controlled auction. We've covered that. Talked about the letter of intent, the basic provisions that are included, price, terms, what's being bought and sold. There's usually an expiration date. When a buyer submits a letter of intent, they don't want to leave this thing open-ended for an extended period of time. Sometimes people refer to this with vivid language by calling it an exploding letter of intent. The seller has to sign and return it within 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. But that's pretty typical. There's usually a clause just to emphasize the buyer is going to do more diligence. And typically there's some kind of provision in there what the aspirational signing and or closing date is going to be. Let's talk real quickly about the no shop provision, what that is. A no shop provision basically says this: here's our letter of intent. We have the buyer, we have the seller, and they sign, and it's non-binding. So we're not making a legal obligation. We're just sort of making a moral commitment to one another that we're going to stand by what it is that we're agreeing to, and we're going to negotiate in good faith. That being said, there's one portion of it which is in fact binding, and you see this in most term sheets, and it's a no shop provision. Basically, what the buyer says is, I'm signing this term sheet, and seller, I want you to sign this term sheet. And all this stuff about the deal terms is non-binding, but this no shop provision is binding, and it prevents you as seller from taking the signed term sheet and walking the planet and trying to induce people to beat it. I don't want to do that. I'm about to spend a lot of time and money on this transaction, on due diligence, on activating professional support systems and networks, on my own people. And I don't want you taking this deal around and seeing if you can get somebody to beat it by a buck. Okay? If you like this letter of intent enough to sign it now, I want you to be bound to keep it quiet and confidential and to work only with me. These no shop clauses, meaning you can't carry it around, you need to keep it confidential, are typically tied. This is typically embedded within it. There's a notion of exclusivity. Seller during this period can only work with buyer, but this too is exploding. There's a time period. It's not forever. And usually the time period is the period of time that the parties think they need to get the deal closed. I can tell you buyers usually like the time period to be long. They want to give themselves plenty of time to negotiate, plenty of time to retrade if they need to, plenty of time to do due diligence, and they want to keep the seller comfortably locked up. Sellers, on the other hand, tend to like short no shop / exclusivity provisions. Why? Because they want buyer nervous. They want buyer working like crazy to get this thing done and get it done quickly. Because while extensions are routinely given, if the deal's not yet done, when this thing's about to expire, they don't have to be given. And seller can always say, I thought I loved you, but we had this 60-day no shop exclusivity period. It's day 59. I think I want to reshop this thing. I think I want to go see if I can find a better buyer because I'm not really happy with the way this has gone. Now, that's a risky proposition. That buyer may be your bird in hand, and you need to be careful when you play a card like that. But there are circumstances where you might, and it makes buyer nervous. So seller knows that it makes buyer nervous, which is why seller likes to have short periods. Keep buyer honest, keep them cranking, and to give themselves some wiggle room if things aren't going well. And that's how a no shop typically works. Deal structure, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this. We talked about the asset deal versus the stock or the share purchase transaction versus the merger. We also talked a little bit here about different types of deal consideration. Of course, there's cash. People love to get cash, but buyers will sometimes use their own stock. That works. Sometimes you'll see something called seller financing. And very loosely put, think about this as similar to an installment sale. Buyer might say, hey, look, I'm willing to pay $5 million for your business. And what I want to do is I want to give you $1 million now at closing. And then I want to pay that $4 million at $1 million per year over 4 years. It's considered seller financing because the way that typically gets memorialized in the documents is through a note, promissory note. That's usually the way it's structured. The seller in that note is the lender. They're essentially lending $4 million to the buyer. May not literally be writing a check, but they sort of are. It's their business assets. The buyer is the borrower, because the buyer has the repayment obligation. It's this contract here. So that's why it's called seller financing, because it's the seller is essentially providing the financing for the transaction. It's not a bank that's providing a loan for $4 million. In effect, the seller is providing a loan for $4 million. You see that in a lot of deals. Now, sellers tend not to like it because they're at risk. They wanted $5 million, say, cash on the barrelhead. Who doesn't? But it may be that this was the only deal they could get. Or maybe someone else said, I'll pay you $3 million for your business today. And this other offer was $5 million, $1 million today, $4 million over time. Sellers taking risk. They have to hope the buyer can pull this off and that they're still going to be around in 4 years. They're not going to go bankrupt or liquidate or otherwise breach or violate the terms of the note. But if they think the buyer's good for it, seller's ultimately going to clear $5 million rather than $3 million. So maybe they elect that deal structure, even though it's less money at closing. So these are the sorts of elements that come into play when you're thinking about consideration and the form of consideration and the methodology behind buying the business. I should also add non-competition agreements, very typical in the M&A world. Buyer is buying the yoga studio at 4th and Vine because they think that it's a great studio with a great following, great reputation, great brand. What they don't want to have happen is the owner operator of that studio to go over to 4th and Walnut and open a new studio the day after closing. Chances are, good portion of the client and customer base, good portion of the suppliers, good portion of all the brand equity and value is going to travel with that person, and buyer is not going to get what buyer wanted to get. So they need to buy some peace of mind. They need to buy some space to operate and build this business, and they get that through a non-competition agreement. Non-competition agreements in employment agreements tend not to exceed 1 year. In states where they're enforceable, and they're enforceable in most states, generally speaking, they're limited to 1 year. Now, certainly there are occasions where I've seen 18-month non-competes and up to 2-year non-competes be enforceable. But it's pretty unusual, and you need to be very careful and thoughtful about where you implement that in the employment context. In the acquisition context, non-competition agreements can be longer. They are routinely at least 2 years, and they're usually somewhere between 3 and 5 years. And the reason for that is from a policy perspective. Basically, courts don't like non-competition agreements and employment contracts. They understand why they are there and why buyers ask for them and should be able to enforce them. But at the same time, we like people to work. We like people to have the opportunity to go pursue their professional dreams, to make money for their families. We don't like to limit those opportunities. And so, courts tend to throw a little shade on non-competition agreements within the context of employment. But within the context of an M&A transaction, it's just a different kettle of fish. The idea is you're selling this company, all the assets associated with it, all the goodness associated with it, all the goodwill associated with it. And yeah, it's perfectly reasonable that, you should also kind of be selling your willingness to not compete. And we get that. It's an asset of sorts, lowercase a, that buyer wants to buy. And so if buyer wants that for 4 years, that strikes us as reasonable. And you should know that going in. So you better make sure you get enough for your company that you're willing to sit on the sidelines for 4 years. Or, it's structured in such a way that you can go get another job doing something someplace else. Perhaps you have to move. But it's worth it to you because you sold the company for a high enough value. What happens with the sale transaction? Well, first of all, we structure the deal, and a lot of this discussion is going to take place during the LOI period. And we talked about this. How much is the company being sold for, and what's the deal consideration, and what are some of the other terms? Earnouts, chat about this briefly. Earnouts, people say, how do you feel about earnouts? And I say I have 3 words: don't do it. But I can tell you that nobody listens to me. Everybody does earnouts because they're just so freaking tempting. Here's the issue. Buyer thinks the company is worth X. Seller thinks the company is worth Y. Okay? X is lower than Y. So this is value. These parties really want to do this deal. It's a good match. Buyer wants to buy, seller wants to sell, but there's this gap on purchase price. Well, of course, one way to solve a gap on purchase price is to compromise, right? Buyer comes up a little bit, seller comes down a little bit. Here's our purchase price. I want to sell my beater Corolla for $1,000. Buyer wants to pay $800 for it. We meet in the middle, do the deal at $900. But what if I want to get $1,000 for my beater Corolla, and buyer's only willing to pay $500? So I'm willing to sell it for $1,000. That's my price. Buyer's willing to pay $500. That's a pretty big gap. I'm asking buyer to come up quite a bit to get to something in the middle. I'm coming down quite a bit to get to something in the middle proportionally. And as a consequence, it may not be feasible. to get to a negotiated endpoint. Well, what happens if we can't agree on price? Well, in theory, we can't get a deal done. Parties really wanted to, but they can't get a deal done. Well, this is where an earnout steps in. And here's what happens with an earnout. Basically, the buyer says to seller, look, here's the deal. I think the company is worth X, and I'm going to give you X right now at closing. But here's what I'm prepared to say. You keep telling me that it's worth Y because this business is going to do this, 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 and this over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And I agree with you. So I'll tell you what, if the business does indeed do this, 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 and this over the next 1, 2, 3, and 4 years, I'll give you this extra bit of consideration. I'll up the purchase price from X to Y. That's called an earnout. And it's an elegant solution, isn't it? It sounds perfect. You know, buyer gets what they want. They buy the company at the price at which they think it's worth, but there's an opportunity for seller to get what they think it's worth. And buyer says, you know what? I'm totally comfortable paying that extra amount and buying the company at that total purchase price if it does perform in my hands the way that you're saying that it will, because it'll be worth it. Well, sounds great. But notice what I said, that the business will perform at this level in my hands. That's the problem with an earnout. Seller doesn't control the business after they sell it. Now, it's spectrum in terms of what's happening. Sometimes, you know, the key players at seller are gone. They don't join buyer. And those assets of seller are just like absorbed and integrated into the overall business of buyer. And it becomes very quickly hard to see, you know, where did the original assets of buyer start and where did these acquire assets stop? And in that case, seller has virtually no going forward control over what's happening with the business, no visibility into how the business is going, and no real ability to tease out how it is its business doing vis-a-vis buyer's other businesses. I can tell you that happens a lot. That's a common deal structure, and an earnout will not be satisfied in that environment. Inevitably, buyer will find a way to game it, and or that's if buyer's acting in bad faith, which can happen, or even if buyer's acting in good faith, they will just, it's a natural human narrative, right? They're just going to present the results in a way that they think is reflective of reality. And lo and behold, the way they think is reflective of reality tends to be beneficial to their best economic outcome. Now, there are occasions where key players, key principals at seller do travel over to buyer, you know, and maybe buyer is willing to operate seller as a totally independent, wholly owned division, which is with its own P&L. Well, there you've got a better shot at it. If the key principles from seller are sticking with the asset, if it's going to be run largely autonomously, and most importantly of all, they know that they can count on sufficient working capital. They're not dependent upon the buyer mothership for cash to run operations and to grow. You know, assuming that macroeconomic conditions cooperate, they probably have a decent shot at achieving the earnout. That's a pretty rare set of circumstances that I just described. It happens, but pretty unique. The advice that I always give to sellers is this. If you're going to agree to an earnout, that's fine. Number one, know that this transaction is going to cost you a lot more in legal fees than it will before, because earnouts routinely will represent 25 to 30% of total legal fees. They are totally one-off. Earnouts are never alike, one to another. There's very little boilerplate that travels through. Everything is contextual, and they are negotiated like crazy, you know, in terms of how things are measured and how information is accessed and how often it's accessed and who has inspection rights and all of these sorts of things. It's incredibly detailed. So I say to my seller client, look, you're going to be paying me a lot. I don't like making money doing something that frankly I don't think is worth it. But if you want it and you'll pay me for it, we'll do it. But hey, eyes wide open. That's point one. Point two is I always say you better be comfortable and happy with X, because chances are this is all you're ever going to see from this deal. So if the only way that you'll be happy with this transaction is if you get Y, then you should think long and hard about if you really want to do this deal, because the contingency associated with this earnout is material, significant, and profound. And you just need to be ready for that. Think about it as gravy. It's the cherry on top. If you get it, you should be delighted. It's a wonderful, unexpected windfall, but don't be counting on it. That's an earnout with a little bit of editorial comment from yours truly. So what happens next once we get on the other side of this LOI? Well, we have due diligence and contracts happening in parallel. Our buyer is engaged in some significant due diligence with seller on all the various fronts. And during this period of time, we're also negotiating the binding acquisition documents, the purchase and sale agreement, any employment agreements, any non-competition agreements. We'll be working on the earnout, maybe the seller financing note. This is all happening during the contract stage. Closing and transition, I cannot talk about this with enough emphasis. That's why I give it 5 arrows, apparently. Even subconsciously, I know how important this is. There is a general trope that many of you have probably heard, which is that M&A transactions destroy more value than they create. That on a net basis, 1 + 1 is not 2 or 2.5 through synergies, the way everybody thinks, but 1 + 1 equals 1.25. That 0.75 in value gets destroyed. And why is that the case, or why is that perceived to be the case? Now, it really comes from 2 directions. The first I've already alluded to a bit. The deal process is super distracting to everyone, but especially to seller. And it's almost inevitable that seller is going to take their eye off the ball. And how can they not? A person can only do so much. We're human. And the time spent in diligence, the time spent in negotiations, the deal documents, the time spent in talking to your new masters, the time spent in all of these sorts of things is time you're not spending on product, time you're not spending in the store, time you're not spending with customers or with suppliers or with new employees or whatever. And your business is going to suffer. So it happens all the time. The business is clicking along, and let's say it's got, routinely over the last 5 years, it has, 20% gross margins. Well, you can bet that first quarter post-closing, the business probably has 10% gross margins. Why? Because it slipped. It happens. So value gets lost there. But the bigger place where value gets lost is that's recoverable. At least it should be. The place where value gets lost on a more durable and sustained way is, and this, most of the blame here tends to sit at the feet of buyer, is that buyer has not done what buyer needed to do to lay the groundwork for a strong and quick integration process. Generally speaking, if the buyer doesn't have a good plan for what happens the minute after closing, this thing is going to fail pretty quickly, because disruption and uncertainty is never good. So if buyer is somewhat naive, somewhat new to the M&A world, doesn't have a great plan of action, doesn't really know how it's going to integrate seller, and buyer is just kind of like, it's all going to work out. Let's see if we can get the payroll piece figured out. And if everybody transfers over, it's all good. Well, here's what's going to happen if you don't really think about it. Employees are going to roll over, and if there's a hiccup with their paycheck, if there's a hiccup with their healthcare benefits, healthcare coverage, if they don't have an office, if they don't know who they're reporting to, if everything seems like it's a total shit show, employees, particularly the best employees, the ones with options, they're going to start leaving. And it may be that they've already started thinking about it because they were afraid of this, and now you've just confirmed it, and they're going to leave and go elsewhere. So now employees start fleeing. Customers and suppliers, problems here. People not getting paid in the way that they need to be paid, people not being treated the way they need to be treated. Telephone lines didn't get ported over, websites are screwed up. All the gazillion things that you need to think about, if they start to fail, if there's choppiness at the beginning, people will just bail. Very few people, very few things, very few businesses are irreplaceable. Most are largely fungible. They may not want to move, but they will. Think about it with my practice. If we're acquired by another law firm And there's a huge problem with the transition. I mean, look, I've worked with a lot of my clients for a long time. I've got deep personal relationships. But if I stop returning telephone calls, if I'm not getting back to people with emails, if people can't find me, they don't know how to get me, they're going to go get another lawyer. So, that's where the value gets destroyed. And it's why when you look at companies that are in the business of buying other companies or do it a lot, it's a machine. They have people in corporate development, and that's usually the function where it lives. Sometimes they might have a group that's literally called M&A. But their job is not only to go find deals and to negotiate and close deals, but their job is to integrate these acquired businesses into the mothership, and they're really good at it. And it's like any business process. If you have people that are dedicated to it and they're experienced professionals, it's going to get done and it'll get done well. And it makes all the difference. And that's where you do get 1 + 1 = 2.5. And you really do get to enjoy those synergies because you hold on to the value of this asset that you just spent all this time trying to acquire. So that takes us through the M&A deal process. Now, what I thought I would do for the time we have remaining is move to another presentation that I have that talks about the acquisition agreement itself. But before I do that, why don't I stop, take a quick sip of coffee, and open the floor for some questions. I would ask this, I can't see you because of the way I'm sharing my screen, so you'll have to go off mute and be willing to holler. To the extent you have a question, I'd love to take it, but try to make it relatively general if you can. So it's the kind of thing that would be of interest and relevant to a lot of people. And in other words, let's not go deep down the kind of Ebitda multiples that we have in the dry cleaning world. Let's try to think about questions broadly pitched. But if anybody has anything like that, I'd love to respond.
Thank you so much, David. We do have a few questions.
I'm ready.
So Rina is asking, what are the top 3 to 5 mistakes that buyers make in M&A? How can they avoid or prevent these mistakes?
Great question. One of them, and the biggest mistake, is the one that I just spoke to, is this notion of post-closing integration. That's a huge mistake that buyer makes, and when buyer, just doesn't focus on that piece of it. The other mistake that I would say that I see buyers make a lot, and sellers make this one too, is there's something that I sometimes call, and I'm not the one to invent this phrase, but there's something called deal fever. And it's a sense that deals develop a momentum of their own. You get so into it that you feel like you can't stop it even if you want to. An example would be, you sometimes see it happen to people who are getting married. And I think we probably have all had friends like that who, they're getting ready to walk up to the altar and they're like, I don't know if I want to do this. And it's not just cold feet. It's one of those things where they're like, I've been feeling this way for a long time, but we registered, and then we moved in together, and then we told our families, and then we sent out all these invitations, and everybody traveled from around the world. And, you feel like you can't say no. If you feel like you need to say no, you need to say no. Okay. It may be painful, may be embarrassing, it may be a problem, but it's a whole lot better than going forward with something that you're not certain about. So, you have to have the wisdom to discern between, just cold feet and profound concern. But if you have that discernment and self-awareness and you're feeling the latter, pursue it. So the buyer, find a way to step out of it. If you're the seller, find a way to step out of it. Find ways to take moments during the deal process to take a breath, clear your head, and be certain that this is something that you really want to do.
Thank you. John is asking, any cost basis adjustments for inflation?
I think that's going to depend transaction to transaction. I don't think I can really generalize. But, it's interesting. Inflation really hasn't been much of an issue for parties over the last decade with the sort of, economy that we've been living and working in. But, people are thinking and seeing that inflation may be creeping in back into the economy at a rate that we've not seen for quite a long time. And so that may be something that you see manifested in a variety of ways in transactions. So it's a good point, and certainly something to keep your eye on.
Thank you. Bill is asking, how does one define the best deal team with knowledge of the nuances to acquire a business? And should you rely on the seller's lawyers and CFO to provide the most up-to-date company information?
Really good question. So I tend to see the deal team as, on the seller side, it tends to be a tandem between the CEO and the CFO. And those two parties tend to be on point, and this tends to be virtually their full-time job during this stretch. Now, other people then will be brought in as necessary. You know, you might, if you have a chief technology officer, if you're a tech company, you may bring that person in for certain key elements of the transaction, but you don't want to absorb all of their time with this. In terms of relying on the attorney and on the CFO, you know, diligence is a challenging process for buyers. You know, how do you know that you are teasing out and smoking out all the information that you need? You know, you start with your questionnaires. You start by asking seller to just start sending you stuff, and your list is comprehensive, and you look for a comprehensive response. That's sort of level one. Level two is you really grind away on representations and warranties, which we're going to talk about here shortly. Representations and warranties speak to the state of the business, and you're going to want to make sure that, as presented in the contract, that they're thorough and that they're as wide-ranging as you can get from the buyer perspective. Note that these tend to bring to this process a little more teeth than just the gentle questionnaire does, because the reps and warranties appear in the purchase agreement. It's a binding legal document. And if seller breaches a rep and warranty, if there's a misrepresentation, buyer has recourse. You know, depending upon when it happens and the way the agreement's structured, they may have the ability to terminate the contract and walk away, or they may have the ability to sue for damages or pursue certain remedies under indemnification, which we'll also talk about briefly. And then the final piece is just what I mentioned, indemnification. The threat to seller that some of what it's getting, some of its purchase price, might be clawed back by buyer through post-closing claims that buyer may make under the indemnification provisions. You know, now you're really getting into seller's wallet. You know, even the most cowboyish sellers that I've worked with, who can be very fast and loose in terms of what they want to disclose, who go through life, you know, asking forgiveness and never permission. That might carry them through the questionnaire stage. That might carry them through the discussion about, hey, you're signing a binding agreement. These reps and warranties need to be accurate. Yeah. I'm taking it seriously. I'll tell the truth. But when you get to the indemnification section and say, hey, you know, if it's discovered that a representation and warranty was breached, you know, you might have to disgorge and give back, depending on the damages suffered by the buyer, 10% of the purchase price, 5%, 50%. As a consequence, has real teeth. You better be careful about this, and you better be as thorough as you can be, and share as much now if you want to get it all cleaned up and ticked and tied in advance and not run that clawback risk later. So those are generally the places where you see those play out.
Thank you. Travis is asking, what's the best way to get M&A experience as a buyer or seller?
Well, so if the best way is, as with most things, is to do it. So, you know, if a lot of it obviously depends upon if you want to do it as a professional advisor, as I do. So if you're a lawyer or an accountant or a banker, broker, other intermediary, you know, find your way to a firm of some sort that does this work, that will give you an opportunity to participate in these transactions. That's certainly a way to do it. From the corporate side, you know, there's no surefire career path here. I would say on the seller side, generally, it's, you know, the best way to do it is to create a company that you can sell. It sounds super trite and glib, but it's the truth. On the buy side, you know, there are big companies that have dedicated groups to M&A. A lot of those people are former bankers who came over and took jobs in that way. But most of the time, what I see is those people come from finance. So there is a path that leads, out of finance. And if you want to get out of sort of, kind of the traditional finance / ops kind of role, and you want to get into M&A, if you go work for a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, Fortune 2000 company, they probably have a dedicated group, and it's probably primarily comprised of finance or former finance people. And that would be another avenue. And it's simply because, number one, the numbers are really important. And, you've got that mastery and that experience. And number two, quite frankly, finance people tend to be accustomed to diligence. A lot of them were former auditors or, grew up in a similar kind of environment doing similar types of things. There's an attention to detail there, and that pays dividends in the M&A process. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. Masumi is asking, can the seller limit the time allotted for the due diligence?
Yes. The best way to do that is by focusing on the no shop and the exclusivity provision in the letter of intent, trying to make it as short as possible. The shorter that clock, or the more limited that clock, the more intensity that the buyer needs to bring, and the less time they have to drive you bananas with all of their requests on requests on requests on requests. So, work hard to try to get that time period to be as short as possible. That's the best way.
Thank you. A question comes from Chris. Are there questions in the due diligence that the seller is not required to answer, or is everything on the table?
I would say certainly everything is on the table. Now, look, real world, sellers are always making decisions about, are they going to be thorough in their disclosure? It's the challenge that buyers have. How do you know that the seller's been, maybe truthful isn't the right word to use, but complete, right? I mean, the seller may not lie, but what if the seller doesn't tell you everything? There's a question, seller, have you always been in compliance with all laws? Well, seller knows that it was in violation of OSHA, has always been in violation of OSHA rules, but no one's ever found out. Does seller tell buyer, yep, I've been out of compliance. Nothing's ever happened. I don't think anything ever will, but I need to be truthful and tell you that. Or do they just keep their mouth shut and not say anything and hope that it never sees light? And if it does see light, hope that it doesn't result in damages to buyer, which seller might be forced to, pay back under indemnification provisions or breach of contract or otherwise. So that's part of the dance. And, part of what sellers are trying to do is make those decisions. I certainly work with sellers who have an instinct to just tell everything. They're terrible poker players. But, they tend to run very tight ships and good businesses, and they're happy to disclose everything. But there are also sellers who are more cowboyish and willing to roll the dice a little bit and maybe not be complete in all the information that they provide. It's a challenge for buyers to try to squeeze it out and keep working the process and say, are you sure? We asked you for this and you said there weren't any. Are you sure there weren't any? Or we asked for this and you said there were 3. It really feels like there were probably 5 or 6. It's really only 3. Just press, but that's the dance.
Thank you. Luntadila is asking, what is the optimal strategy when working with a legal counsel whose negotiation advice doesn't have solid financial standing? Or better, when is a good time to fire a legal counsel?
Wow, you're asking me to speak ill of my brothers and sisters in the law. If you know me at all, you know that it doesn't take much for me to speak ill of my brothers and sisters in the law. So this is a delightful question to receive. I think here's what I would say is that M&A is it's a very special, and it's a very nuanced, it's a very specialized, and it's a very important transaction. And it's important that you get the right lawyer. And I would even go so far, I'll even acknowledge this. I'm a deal lawyer. I've done a lot of M&A transactions over the last 25 years. I teach it at, top 10 law schools. But, I had clients in the last year who had M&A deals where I didn't feel like I should run point alone. And I went within my firm, I'm a partner at a large law firm, and I went and I found another partner who had done those types of M&A transactions in the past. And I sort of acted as the relationship partner. I had experience with this client. I knew this client. I knew the business. I could add a lot of value there, but I leaned on my partner to do the technical work. And this is coming from an experienced M&A lawyer. So what I would say to you first and foremost is don't feel like you need to be loyal to your general business lawyer just because they've been your general business lawyer. Go get the best M&A lawyer that you can afford. I'm not asking you to break the bank. Get the best that you can afford, and don't be hesitant to get somebody new. Now, that being said, there's a role for your former lawyer to play as well. They can be the interface between you and that M&A lawyer. They can carry a lot of the load, and they may be cheaper. So it's also a way that you can sort of manage the cost a little bit. You rely on this M&A expert for the truly sophisticated stuff, but basic blocking and tackling, you can lean on your existing lawyer. You can also use your existing lawyer to help you, keep that M&A lawyer honest. They should know the questions to ask. They can help you perhaps get, not only a good estimate, but maybe even a fixed fee. And at the very least, they will be reviewing the bills and, challenging this M&A lawyer if they feel like if it's getting out of bounds, and they can do so as an expert. So there are blended roles and roles that you can take and play here. But I do think it's important to start with experienced M&A counsel. And if you get an experienced M&A lawyer that comes highly recommended, I don't think you're going to need to fire this person. So the termination is not something that's going to arise. If it happens, you're probably in a really bad spot, because if you've engaged an M&A lawyer and you're firing them before the deal is over, this is going to be really clunky. Your landing is going to be rough. To have to unplug somebody halfway through the transaction and plug somebody new in. It happens really rarely. People tend to try to do anything other than that. But if you're forced to do it, you're forced to do it, and you swallow hard and take a beat, bring someone else in, and then, just go forth and do your best to try to get the deal done.
Thank you. Jeffrey is asking, you identified valuation earlier but didn't address it. From a legal perspective, what are the key insights sellers should be aware of?
So as it relates to valuation, a lot will depend upon the industry that you're in. So let me just give an example. I've mentioned several times now that I tend to represent a lot of tech companies. A lot of these tech companies that I represent are software as a service companies, SaaS companies. In SaaS, there is a metric known as ARR. It stands for annual recurring revenue. It's not GAAP revenue. It tends to be more like what people think of as bookings. It's a super loose way of referencing it. And there's probably an accountant someplace that's starting to shake and shiver by that analogy, but it's close enough. And in that area, in the area of SaaS, there are metrics that are applied from a valuation perspective. Generally speaking, a SaaS company will be valued at 6 to 10 times ARR. Now, that's quite a lot of variability, 6 to 10, right? And what goes into that? Well, churn goes into that. Are you losing customers as quickly as you're bringing them on? What are your margins in other places? That matters. What's your growth rate? How quickly are you growing or not? Those can make the difference between getting a 6X or getting a 10X. I've certainly seen 4X. I did a deal last year where I was on the buy side, and we bought a SaaS company for 32X. That's a little different than 6 to 10. That was a strategic acquisition. That's a good place to be, okay? Which is the art that comes into this. Sometimes the buyers really want you, because with the right buyer, there's a lot that they can do with you. So that's SaaS. Another common variable that people point to is Ebitda, right? Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization on the income statement. In a lot of businesses, a typical metric would be 4 times Ebitda, or 7 times Ebitda, or 6 times Ebitda. This is where investment bankers can help. This is where accountants with experience in the space can help. This is where lawyers can help. I don't sell a lot of small manufacturing companies, so I don't know what the right EBITDA multiple is. I can sell a manufacturing company, but I'm not going to be able to speak with authority as to what that is. So I wouldn't want, my sell side client to rely on me, or my buy side client to rely on me for that. I'd want them to get that information from somebody else who does know. But those are common metrics. Sometimes people look at, gross revenues or net revenues. Margins can be another place to look. And then, of course, as I've alluded to already, there's strategic value. And those tend to be the best deals with the juiciest values and the best outcomes. If the buyer can be enticed to believe that this is truly strategic for them, that they can take this one asset and blow it out into the equivalent of 12 with the power of their scale, the power of the experience, the power of their distribution network, whatever it is, they may be willing to pay a lot of money for this seller that has no real grounding or relationship with financial performance or financial projections for that matter. It's purely associated with perceived strategic value. On the seller side, if you're able to move the conversation into that realm, you're probably going to do really, really well. That's the brass ring.
Thank you. A question comes from Dan. Why startup company for sales? Would you provide some examples? Or what's the pros and cons from the seller point of view?
So could you read that one more time?
Yes. So Dan is asking, why startup company for sales? Would you provide some examples? Or he's asking, what are the pros and cons from the seller point?
Yeah, so look, I'm of a belief that everybody's for sale. So, venture-backed tech and biotech startups, they're intended to be sold. Some go public, but the vast majority of them are built to be sold. So you start with that. But look, everybody's got a price. And so I think in that respect, everybody is open to being bought if the price and the circumstances are right. Pros and cons. We've talked a lot about the way a deal gets structured and making sure you get the best outcome. Let me offer this as a soft perspective on it, particularly if you're on the selling side. You need to think about, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I can tell you, I can't even count the number of clients I've had who have built great companies, sold them when they were in their 40s and early 50s, cashed a really big check. And after about a year of fun and golf and boating and vacations, found themselves bored out of their mind with no idea how they were going to fill their days until they ended up in the ground. And that's not a great place to be. You've got a healthy personal balance sheet. You've got a lot of money in your bank account, but what are you going to do? We all have to fill our days, and you want to fill your days with something interesting. And if filling your day with something interesting means that you're running this business, then you probably aren't a great candidate to sell it. And don't feel like you have to. You don't. You may be better off, keeping the thing going because you just enjoy it. You enjoy running this business. You enjoy operating it. Don't feel like you have to. Feel like you want to. And if you do want to, do some work to know what life is going to look like for you on the other side of that line so you're ready for it. And you're prepared to really enjoy the benefits of your labor, that you don't reach a point where you're just kicking around the house, driving your spouse crazy, driving your kids crazy, driving your dogs crazy, and driving yourself crazy. You really want to, and I can't tell you how often that happens. It happens all the time. So it's not a financial statement issue. It's not a dollars and cents issue. It's an existential issue.
Thank you. A question comes from Jason. For a business between 5 and 20 million in revenue, what should a business owner be doing with financials in the years leading up to a potential sale? Specifically, audited financial statements for the last 10 years. Is this material?
It's a great question. So audited financial statements, that's the gold standard, right? And there's so much that audited financial statements communicate. And just for those of you who may not know what this means, there are, financial statements get created by the business itself, perhaps with the help of outside accountants. But then there's a sense that if these can be validated by some third party, there's an elevated element of certainty and credibility that's associated with it. And there are different levels of review with different terms that are applied. And the highest level of review, the most intensive level of review is an audit. And if you've gone out and then you've engaged a credible outside auditing firm to come in and audit your financial statements and to present these financial statements in audited form, and presenting them in a way that they're consistent with GAAP and generally applicable accounting principles, and that they're saying, look, we are a third party. We have no other attachment to this business. We've come in and these are the audited financials. What that tells the buyer is that it says, number one, I can rely on these financials because someone else has looked at them. So it's not, I don't have the cowboy problem of, these things being loosey-goosey and probably really wrong. So that's number one. And it's incredibly valuable. It's going to make your due diligence process go so much smoother because your buyer has got just a lot of confidence in you and what you're presenting, number one. And number two, when I say the diligence process is going to go smoother, not just with respect to financials, but with respect to everything, because an audit suggests seriousness of purpose. It suggests that you run a tight ship, and you're going to get a halo effect that it's associated with that and attached to that. And that's going to show up throughout the transaction. You're going to get the benefit of the doubt. The buyer's going to say, hey, I trust this person. So the audit serves a great purpose. Now, look, audits are expensive and audits take a lot of time. So what I'm not sitting here doing is endorsing that everybody who's participating in this webinar, regardless of stage, size, appetite, et cetera, go out and engage an auditor to audit your financial statements. That may be precisely the wrong use of resources, time, and assets right now. But if you were an organization of any size, and I think $5 to $10 million in revenue certainly represents a company of some real size. And if you look like you may be trajecting toward an M&A transaction, or at least you want to be in a position where you can take advantage of it, it's great to see 2 to 3 years of audited financials. I mean, 10, that's awesome. That's gravy. But I'm accustomed to seeing at least 2 to 3 years. So a lot of my clients will float along for a while without an audit. But if they do feel like they're ramping, we try to get the audit done so that we can get a couple of years of audited statements under our belt before we go out and seriously try to market the company for sale.
Thank you. There's not a question, but a case from Chris, if you can give your opinion. We are a franchise. I have just signed a letter of intent. The franchisor has indicated that they do not want detailed due diligence until they have received the purchase agreement. This makes no sense to me. Any buyer would be reluctant to do this. The franchisor will not approve the sale until they have the purchase agreement, and then they vet the buyer and approve them to buy the franchise.
Yeah, I mean, that can be frustrating. Anytime, it could be a challenge with a lot of transactions, and with franchise situations, it's really accentuated. And it's the notion of third parties, right? So, we've spent this entire webinar so far, all 90 minutes of it plus so far talking about buyers and sellers, but there are other actors and actresses that are floating around the periphery. Of course, we have the professionals involved in the deal, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about third parties like the franchisor, or like other third parties to agreements that seller in particular is a party to. Most material contracts that seller is a party to will contain a provision that requires that seller go get that third party's consent to any change of control. Sometimes it shows up as an anti-assignment clause, which is especially triggered by an asset deal. It's one of the downsides to an asset deal. Sometimes you can finesse around those with other deal structures, but a lot of these contracts now, get away from that kind of deal structure to deal structure variability by simply including change of control provisions, which is going to pick up any kind of M&A transaction deal structure. And they'll say, you have to give our permission, and you can sort of understand it, right? I mean, basically this third party saying, look, I like you. I trust you. We have a working relationship, but I don't want you just assigning this out from under me to some other company that I've never done business with. or that might be a competitor of mine, or might be someone that I had a bad experience with. And so I want to have some say. I don't want to just be stuck working with them because I'm still a party to this agreement that you were able to move over to someone else. And so a big part of any M&A process, and it's the least sexy part, is going out and getting these consents. And as this question indicates, different third parties have different thresholds. Some are willing to do it just right off the front. They're sort of saying, "Who are you talking to?" "Oh, you're talking to that? No problem. Here, just send me something and I'll sign it." Or, I'm not going to sign anything now, but just know that unless this thing gets really squirrely, I'll sign whatever you send me. Just keep me posted. Other people say, "No, I'm going to wait. There needs to be, if I'm going to need to spend time on this, I'm going to need to do due diligence. I'm going to need to dive in. I'm going to need to understand it. And this is hardly my highest priority. I've got a lot going on in my business, and I'm not just going to press pause so that I can dig into your deal, particularly if it's early. I want to wait until this thing is much more ripe and much more certain. That's when I'll get in and dig in and do it." Now, that's frustrating because in some respects they have a veto, and you'd like to know sooner rather than later what's going on, rather than getting too far down the path and then having them exercise that. But it's their prerogative. And the best you can do is just to keep on them and keep pecking away and trying to manage the process to bring them into it. But, third-party dependencies exist everywhere in these deals and in lots of different places. And this is the place where they show up, and it can be really frustrating. I empathize with you. I get it. And it's really frustrating, but for better or for worse, not uncommon.
Thank you. There's a comment for you from Luntadila. "David, that's a great recommendation. To add on that, to save business owners money, I would recommend annual reviews, which is lower level to audits. When necessary and depending on the size of the firm or lender's requirement, then considering an audit would make financial sense." Any thoughts on this?
I agree 100%.
Thank you.
Well said.
Thank you. And now we have the last question from Travis. Travis is asking, are there case studies or books that you'd recommend to gain more knowledge?
That's a good question. Honestly, most of the literature that I have found is not terribly useful. What I would say is this: if you can find some really good bulletins on law firm and accounting firm websites, I think they're actually better than books. So, and you're doing Google searches or Bing, if that's how you roll. And you're looking for information, and your searches can be as generic as you want them to be. It means you're going to have to filter through more stuff. But I mean, look, I would tell you that in teaching my course, I go to those sources all the time in trying to find, nice, abbreviated, kind of efficient explanations of, what is a representational warranty? What is indemnification? What is an asset sale? When should I consider a merger? Those sorts of things. You put those in for search terms, you're going to get some good stuff back. I'll tell you also, there's some good YouTube videos available. I have a couple on my channel. I have a YouTube channel, and you can find some there. I talk in more detail about deal structures, asset deals, stock deals, mergers. It's probably a total of about 90 to 120 minutes of content on those deal structures. I also talk about choice of entity and have some other videos up too that are more venture related. But I'm not the only one. And there are other people that put out videos that are not as long-winded as I am. So instead of investing 120 minutes, you can probably invest 12 and get some good information too. So I would stay away from Amazon, and instead I would take advantage of free resources that you can just sort of pilfer off of YouTube and off of law firm and accounting firm and investment banking websites.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for this great webinar, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, if you need mentoring, please visit chicago.score.org and submit a mentoring request, and you'll be assigned a mentor to work with. And now back to you, Hannah.
David, before we continue, do you have another part to this? I just want to make sure that we've got everything covered.
No, sure. I mean, if people, by my clock, we have 12 minutes left. Is that what you have too, Hannah?
Yes, we have a lot of time. Absolutely.
Well, let's take advantage. So I'm glad we took time for questions because that's the most important part of this. I hadn't planned for so much time for questions, but it's wonderful because it makes it means the webinar is contextual and it's being responsive to what people want and need. So I'm grateful for the questions, and hopefully folks got some value from them. So let's go, in the time we have remaining, let's look at the form of acquisition and take a peek at this. Again, this is I'm not even gonna say 30,000 feet, this is 100,000 feet. But just so you have a general sense as to what the architecture of a purchase agreement looks like and what's involved. We've already talked about some of these issues, right? So we talked about an asset versus stock versus merger transaction and why you think about that. Who prepares the draft? Typically the buyer does. Generally the buyer prepares the draft. And the debate always is should the draft be fair or should it be overreaching? If the buyer presents a draft which is overreaching, to pro buyer, of course one might say, well, they're entitled to do that, and it's up to seller to pull it back to the center. But what that can do is it can send a really bad tone from the beginning. And I will tell you, even when I'm on the buy side, I like to start with a fair draft. It's going to lean pro buyer, and I'll tell my counterparty that unapologetically. Of course, it's going to lean pro buyer, but it's not going to be so pro buyer that it's going to be offensive or that it's going to cause somebody to freak out. And I'll tell you why, even on the buy side, you're motivated from that perspective. It's not normally the case that you have a clean transaction between buyer and seller where the assets and liabilities move to buyer and the people that are involved in seller just leave and don't go with them. Almost always, buyer is going to try to get some of the key principles to come along. And you can bet those key principles probably had an ownership interest in the seller and probably participated and were involved in this transaction one way or the other. And if you come out of the gate with an overreaching purchase agreement and you set this tone that you're going to be difficult to deal with and you're going to be smug and arrogant and pushy, these people that you're trying to hire, yeah, good luck. I mean, you're not incenting them to want to come over and join the buyer party. So it's something to be mindful of, and it's a debate we always have. Particularly if you're on the buy side, I'm always having that conversation with my client, saying, "What kind of purchase agreement do you want? How strongly do you want us to come out of the gate? Do you want us to come out showing our teeth, or do you want us to come out with something mild mannered and pretty much center of the road?" And I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, center of the road. Because buyers know that they need to keep sellers excited and enthusiastic because they want them to perform. Here are the basic elements of a purchase agreement. No surprise. Who are the parties to the deal? What's the purchase price? And what's the form of consideration? When are we going to do the closing? Let's talk a little bit about the balance of these provisions. When you look at time, we have this period of, sorry, screen's a little jumpy. We sign it, and then we close it. So what's happening during this period? Well, we have sort of the beginning of seller all the way up to the moment of signing. Then we have this interregnum period between signing and closing, and this is where we're getting our third-party consents. This is where we're checking other boxes that we need to check, maybe getting stockholder approval where that's required, those sorts of things. Then we close the transaction. Oh my goodness. And then we close the transaction. And after we close the transaction, then we have the post-closing period. What's happening after the closing? Reps and warranties speak to this period of time. Reps and warranties speak to what's happened from the beginning of time up until the signing. What's the state of the business? Has the business been in compliance with laws from the beginning to the signing date? But if they fall out of compliance up here, no liability. You don't represent and warrant to the future. It's not a covenant, which is a promise. A covenant is different. So you're going to have a covenant that's going to run here. This is probably your non-competition agreement, right? It runs forward. It's a promise to do something in the future. A rep and warranty speaks to what the state of the company is. Now, in this interregnum period, you're probably going to have some covenants, some promises that are going to exist during the state, like the seller agrees to operate the business in the ordinary course between signing and closing, right? They have a binding obligation to sell this company to the buyer, but they're still running it during this period of time. So they make a promise, a covenant to run it properly. The other thing that happens is that sellers or buyers going to say, look, I'm glad that these reps all speak to this period, but you've been running the business during this period. I need to the reps to cover this period as well. They'll get something called a bring down certificate, which is where the seller brings down its reps. It says, my reps and warranties were true at signing, and I'm telling you right now, they're true at closing. So now the reps speak to this point in time. If something happens here that's a breach of a rep, it's not a breach of a rep. Reps don't speak to the future. They speak to the moment that they're given and what's happened in the past. So those are the representations and warranties. Those are the covenants. Conditions to closing all appear during this period of time between signing and closing. What needs to happen in order for the deal to close? They're closely associated with the covenants. Termination, what rights do the parties have to terminate the agreement between signing and closing? And then indemnification, hugely important. This is post-closing. What sort of rights and remedies? It generally favors the buyer. What recourse does buyer have against seller if it discovers that seller made a misrepresentation about something that happened during this period of time, or didn't actually perform its covenant in the way that was required? What right do they have? What recourse do they have to the extent they suffer damages in this post-closing period? The indemnification provision. I can tell you that this provision is incredibly negotiated, very tightly, very detailed, because from the seller's perspective, this is risky. There's the concern about clawback. I thought I was getting $10 million for my business. I don't want to give back $3 million of that because buyer is going to create these trumped up charges later on and claim that they suffered all these damages. So I want to make sure that this is really boxed in so that I can sleep at night and know that I can spend this money and that it's truly mine, that it's not at risk. That's what indemnification is all about. And if you're involved in selling a company or buying a company, you're going to become intimately familiar with indemnification and all its fun terms like baskets and mini baskets and caps and survival periods and escrow and all that kind of stuff. Highly technical provisions that go to managing the indemnification process. Representations and warranties, predictably, as we've said, they go to diligence. It's part of information gathering, and it's also allocation of risk. Who is agreeing to what sort of risks as to certain information that exists in that pre-closing or pre-signing period? The parties sort that out through the representations and warranties. There are lots of different ways, lots of different reps and warranties that you'll typically see. Here are some common ones. Seller exists, no conflicts in entering into this contract. We've told you all of our liabilities. We have title to these assets that we're selling you. Here are all our contracts. We've told you about all our litigation. Nothing here that leaps off as a big surprise. The kind of typical stuff that buyer's going to want to know about. Buyer, they typically make reps and warranties, but they're pretty limited. If buyer's paying in cash, seller really doesn't care that much about buyer. I don't care, fine. Just if buyer has been legally created and buyer has the legal right to pay me this cash, that is all I need to know. Now, if this is a seller finance transaction and seller is relying on buyer to perform and remain solvent for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years so that buyer gets all that future money, well, so seller gets that future money, seller is going to be highly motivated to make sure that buyer is what buyer says that it is. And the reps and warranties may be more extensive in that kind of a deal structure. So buyer's reps and warranties very much are dependent. The scope of the reps and warranties are going to be dependent on deal structure. But even in the worst case scenario for buyer, I would say they are always smaller in scope and less profound than the reps and warranties that seller is required to give within the context of an acquisition. Covenants, as mentioned, those are promises looking forward. Conditions, these are the conditions to close. If a condition is not satisfied and the deal can't close because the condition hasn't been satisfied, the other party basically has two alternatives. They can terminate and say, we're out, we're not doing the deal, or they can negotiate. So it's a place where the parties have a chance to have another bite at the apple if they find that that's the case. So if they discover that there's been a misrepresentation, by seller, buyer can terminate, or buyer can say, hey, you told me that you were in compliance with laws, we haven't closed yet, but we found out about that OSHA stuff. Thanks for telling me, or not. This is going to be a real problem. We're prepared to proceed with the transaction, but you're going to have to knock $500,000 off the purchase price. That's the kind of thing that takes place. So there you have it. That's the basic architecture of a purchase agreement. So we have covered a ton of ground in slightly less than 2 hours. I hope you found it useful. I hope you got a lot out of it. I enjoyed it. I always do enjoy these presentations. I left you my email address. Don't hesitate to reach out. Follow me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, have a great evening. You've certainly earned your happy hour.
David.
As have I.
David, it's always such an excellent, insightful presentation with you as always. I love how you explain these complicated concepts into really easy to understand language, and you even put in some humor into it too. So there's genius in that. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Oh, wow, genius. I'll take it. I'll come back next time. Thanks.
Thanks.
Nice of you to say.
Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. And Toma, thank you for fielding the questions. And to those of you who joined in today, thank you for taking the time to really invest in yourself and your business growth. And remember, you're not alone. SCORE is here to support you, so please stay connected with us. Keep attending our webinars and schedule that appointment with our mentors. And David is also willing to go ahead and answer your questions. So make sure you I hope you took down his email address. Otherwise, reach out to Toma at SCORE. And just to remind you, the mentoring sessions are always free and confidential and can be scheduled from a website at chicago.score.org. David, Toma, Bill, the whole team, thank you again. And to everybody who attended, hope to connect with all of you again. Stay safe and well, and bye for now.